We've all become God's madmen. All of us.
Bram Stoker's Dracula is a 1992 horror film directed by Francis Ford Coppola. In 1462, after a successful battle against the Ottoman Empire, Dracula returns home to find his wife, Elisabeta, has committed suicide. She was tricked into believing he had died. Dracula, believing God should have protected Mina due to his victory in the name of the Lord, renounces his faith and swears he will rise from the grave with all the powers of darkness. In 1897, Jonathan Harker travels to Transylvania to finalize a real estate purchase for Count Dracula. He is imprisoned there while Dracula seeks out his fiancée, Mina, believing she is the reincarnation of his wife. Mina's friend, Lucy, is seduced by Dracula's powers, and soon Mina finds herself in his thrall too. Harker escapes and marries Mina. Enraged by this, Dracula becomes more aggressive, murdering Lucy. Abraham Van Helsing assists Harker, Lucy's fiancé, and her other suitors in finding and defeating Dracula. In the end, Mina is saved and Dracula is killed. Christianity and the battle between good and evil flow throughout the story. The novel and the film are mired in faith and critical of it. Dracula himself is a perversion of Jesus Christ. He promises everlasting life to all those who accept him. Renfield receives this promise only to be killed after the madman's betrayal. Mina ingests the blood of Dracula to attain her immortality, much in the same way that sacramental wine represents or becomes the blood of Christ. Dracula tells Harker that blood is too precious a thing in these days. He recounts his lineage, his bloodline. The significance of blood in Christianity raises the conflict between Van Helsing and Dracula to that of a holy war. Dracula himself was a soldier in a holy war. In the opening of the film, the narrator says that he protected all of Christendom from Muslim Turks. When the clergymen tell Dracula that his wife, Elisabeta, is condemned to hell due to her suicide, he renounces his faith, questions how a benevolent God could damn his wife, and he strikes the cross with his sword. He drinks the blood and gains a perverted kind of eternal life. Harker would not normally wear a crucifix. It was a gift for protection. The novel's Harker refers to himself as an English churchman, meaning Protestant, whereas wearing a cross around the neck at that time would be more Catholic. There is a great deal of commentary about the conflict between Protestants and Catholics in the novel, but in Coppola's film, Christianity is instead streamlined into a singular force against the darkness. What Dracula calls trinkets of deceit position the conflict as a holy war. Van Helsing's armaments are religious, specifically his use of the crucifix as a weapon. An interesting choice for the film is that the aforementioned Christian symbols from the novel are no longer all-powerful. Rather than the ultimate weapon against evil, the crucifix is easily destroyed by the power of vampires. The brides hiss at Harker's crucifix and dissolve it into liquid. Dracula, in his demonic bat form, sets another crucifix on fire simply by looking at it and stamping his foot. Lucy vomits blood on Van Helsing's crucifix. From the release of the novel until the release of Coppola's film, we see a decline in Christian power, or at least the greater freedom to question that faith. The cold condemnation of the priest and Dracula's more sympathetic portrayal than in other versions are more evidence of this. In the book Reading the Vampire, Ken Gelder claims that Dracula and perhaps other vampires are modeled on anti-Semitic stereotypes, the bizarre and false caricature of its time, a blood-sucking, baby-stealing Jew. If this attitude is shocking, bear in mind that Victorian society was notorious for both its attempts at pious Christian morality and for its hypocrisy. The idea that carnal desire, for example, was unaccounted for is something of a myth. Discussing sex, rather, was unacceptable. Of course, sex still happened, obviously, but it was not only private, but shameful. The strict moral codes drove people to double lives, an upright public life and a private life, with the facade that the latter did not exist. Sexual behavior, especially that of women, was publicly viewed as obscene. Dracula seduces Mina with his magic and his shapeshifting and hypnotic powers. This era helped popularize what is commonly called the Madonna whore complex. a term both in century-old psychology and sexual politics that brands women as either pure virgins or sexually promiscuous and therefore inconsequential.
Kiss me and caress me, my darling husband, please.
In Dracula, Lucy and Mina are representative of this dichotomy. Lucy openly talks about sex, and Mina is comparatively shy until she is infected with vampirism. Lucy is subtextually punished for her deviation from Victorian norms. When Van Helsing and his cohorts discover Lucy has been transformed into a vampire, Arthur penetrates her with a stake and returns her to her virginal purity, clad in white. Arthur and Van Helsing see no other choice but to return her to her more socially acceptable state, even if that is of the grave. This film adaptation portrays both Mina and Dracula as more romantic than in the source material, as well as most other adaptations, perhaps updating it a little past the Victorian era, but the Madonna whore complex still shows its face. Lucy cannot be saved, but Mina can. Lucy and Dracula's brides echo a concept that is both a biblical tale and a facet of social politics. The idea among men that the desires of women will create a fall from grace for all. In the essay The Importance of Blood During the Victorian Era, Nilufer Pectus said that the three beautiful vampires that Jonathan Harker encounters in Dracula's castle represent all of the qualities of how a woman should not be: voluptuous and sexually aggressive. The Tsarina Catherine is the name of one of the ships that Dracula uses. The name of the ship is taken from the Russian Empress, Catherine the Great, whose political opponents condemned for being allegedly promiscuous. In reality, this was probably a smear tactic. The infamous horse story is apocryphal, but that's not the point. This historical reference implies that should Van Helsing and the others fail in their attempt to save Mina, she will become the same sexual creature as Lucy or the vampire brides. Our fantasies are reflections of ourselves, and with so much sexuality intermingled with our movie monsters, there must be something there, something instinctual that we are creating when we write these stories, not even realizing it, and when we watch these films without fully comprehending why we are so attracted to these monsters. Dracula, as a novel, was meant to both tantalize its readers with its sexually provocative imagery and still entrench it within Victorian values. As a film, some of this is expanded with nudity and sex scenes, but one aspect is diminished in Coppola's adaptation. The romantic misery of Dracula, first with his deceased wife and then with Mina, designates him very strictly heterosexual, whereas the novel paints his conquests as more demonic, and from the perspective of some critics, homosexual. Jonathan's submissiveness and Dracula's command over his brides, saying that Jonathan belongs only to him, is often interpreted that way, as is Dracula's desire to penetrate Jonathan with his fangs. Dracula's desire is to become part of the mainstream human world through his disguise. Normally, he stays hidden away in his castle where the world can't see him. In the Victorian era, such a homosexual would be considered a monster. In the book Our Vampires Ourselves, Professor Nina Arbach wrote, "Innovative in his isolation, Dracula can do nothing more than catalyze homoerotic friendship among the humans who hunt him. His story abounds in overwrought protestations of friendship among the men who testify breathlessly to each other's manhood." In other words, Dracula mixes among the community of men, but is not allowed to join it. Again, the fact that this is a film adaptation that focuses much more attention on Dracula's romantic side, that is more exclusive to women, is a sign of the times. Demonizing homosexuality is not something to be passed down. Another fear in Victorian England was that of xenophobia, and Dracula embodies this too. Dracula's lust for blood and desire to emigrate to England for nefarious purposes comes from this country's fear of foreigners. British colonialism meant acquiring control over other countries and other populations, but heaven forbid those same populations actually seek a new life in England. Van Helsing notes that Dracula can only survive by importing the dirt of his homeland. In other words, this story for a Victorian audience is saying that this evil foreigner does not belong here.
Transylvania is not England. Our ways are not your ways.
Dracula was a novel that reflected the fears of late Victorian society, the sexuality of women, homosexuality, the conflict between Protestants and Catholics, but it was also about the hope for something greater, that these fears could be conquered. If Dracula is the personification of these fears, then his defeat in the end is the manifestation of that hope. This film adaptation silences some of these fears. Mina, for example, has a larger role. There are times when she even has agency, and the final moments are all hers. It is by her will that Dracula regains a piece of his soul. In this version, Christianity is not divided, and it is safe to question one's faith. The antagonist cannot be mistaken for a homosexual demon, and so forth. In this way, the film tells us that Dracula, or what he represented, can be defeated. Hi everyone, if you like what I do, please click on the orange Patreon link below. That's how this show happens. It's also the only way to request an episode. Also, there are other benefits to pledging, so check it out. The information is on my Patreon page. I'll see you next week.